From a cornfield in upstate New York, sitting in the kitchen of his parents' home, where a police officer read him his rights, although I do like these new counters. Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Pete Dominic. Hello, everybody. I'm sitting in my parents' kitchen. I am recording this in front of my mom and dad while my dad pets the dog, and I have an excellent guest for you. Joining me today, it's our favorite historian. It's Kenneth C. Davis, who has a brand new book out. Mom, you're going to love this new book. It is about great short books. That's the title of it. Great short books. A year of reading briefly. He compiled these introductions to 58 short novels. That's what he did with his pandemic year. And oh, I love it. It is introducing me to some of my favorite old classics and some brand new short books I've never heard of, and making me want to read fiction more than I've wanted to in a long time. That's right. Kenneth C. Davis joins me today. It is the day before Thanksgiving. We're here at my parents', and I am going to just throw to the interview. I don't have any special bells or whistles for you tonight, whenever you're listening to this. But I do have a great conversation with Kenneth C. Davis, and I'll be posting new conversations tomorrow and Friday as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for pressing play, for subscribing, for your paid subscription. If you're not signed up for a paid subscription, you should do that right now, standupwithpete.com. And I hope that you, if I don't talk to you, if you don't hear from me, have a great Thanksgiving or whatever that you do. I hope you get some time off. Now it's time to get to that conversation with my favorite historian. He's written so many great books. You got to get them all. If you're thinking about a gift for somebody who listens to the show, ask for this gift. Get all of Kenneth C. Davis's books. Don'tKnowMuch.com. And today, well, we went live. This first couple of minutes is us live on Twitter a couple days ago, and then the rest of our conversation. He's still on Twitter, if that's a thing. Get this book. You won't regret it. It's a great gift. Let's do it. Congratulations, sir. Thank you for joining me. And why do you think people will love, of course, your new book?
Pete, thank you so much. It's always a great pleasure to join you. A lot of people think, oh, I'm the historian, but the fact is I've lived a life in books. And so this book is a kind of return to my basic roots. It is a book that came out of the pandemic. I was, like everyone else, sitting there, depressed, anxious, sleepless, tense. And instead of continuing to doom scroll through the horrific news, I started to read short fiction because my attention span was short. So I really focused on reading short books, novels of 200 pages or less, easily read sometimes in one sitting, certainly within a week's worth of time. And I ended up reading 58 great short books and writing about them, what's in them, why you should read them, about their authors and their place in history, which is an important part of this for me. And the real point of the book is a celebration of reading as a healing thing.
Yes.
For me, reading fiction at night became a lifesaver. It was a balm. And it was not because I was escaping reality. It was, instead, I would call it an antidote to reality. Because the fiction I was reading was not just, happy stories to take me away from the reality that we were all living through, but it was a way to, in many ways, focus on truth. Great novels, great fiction, really, even though they're made up for the most part, really often get at truth, the truth for which you've forgotten to ask. And that's what this book is about. It's also about the incredible importance, and I didn't set out to do this when I was reading the book, but it's about the importance to read and the extraordinary danger of book banning.
Yes,
We're watching this going on right now around the country. And it's a really frightful idea to me as a writer, as a citizen. It's a scary idea. Frederick Douglass, the great American emancipationist, abolitionist who was born in slavery, wrote about the fact that when he was a child, he was forbidden to learn to read. And he understood that he had to teach himself to read because that was the way to freedom. And so I believe also that reading is a way that we will free ourselves and keep free. And the reason that these people want to ban books is not because they're afraid of some dirty scenes or a little sex or bare breasts in Mouse by Art Spiegelman. They're afraid of ideas. We are in a war of ideas right now, and books are weapons in the war of ideas. Franklin D. Roosevelt said that during World War II. So that's why this book is certainly about the pleasure and joy and value, the insight, the inspiration of reading great fiction. But it's really also about the importance, the need to read. So I hope people will pick the book up, look at the 58 books and writers I've written about and described. Some of them are familiar. Some may be unfamiliar. I did that for a reason. I read some books again.
Yes.
And I read some writers for the first time. So there are, and it goes from Voltaire in 1759 to Colson Whitehead, the Nickel Boys in 2019. So it covers a great deal of time.
Yes, I'd not heard of his work, and I loved reading that chapter and every single thing else. Some people learned to bake a bread during the pandemic. You wrote a book about books, which is a resource of sorts. And I have really enjoyed reading this for so many reasons. But I think the thing that I like the most is all of these 58 books, which you introduce us to, you include first lines for everyone, which is the first basically few sentences or paragraph of the book. I love that teaser. You never give away the plots, of course. Why did you do it that way? And it is working, I can tell you that.
Okay. Well, to me, one of the beauties of the great short novel is that they usually, because they're short, every word counts. And the first lines almost are always real grabbers in these books. They set you up, they pull you in. I compared great short novels in writing this to a first date. It's kind of exciting, pleasurable, mysterious at first. It can be memorable. It leaves you wanting a little bit more. It can go in many possibilities, but there's no long-term commitment. So that's kind of the idea here. But a first date, you want it to get off to a great start. So I've used the first lines of all of these 58 books to pull you in, because I think that these books all pull the reader in, whether it's something as simple as, where's Papa going with that axe? One of the great lines in all of literature, the first line of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. But, and people will instantly say, wait a minute, that's a kid's book. Is this about kids' books? It is not. First of all, it is a children's book, but I think it's one of the most perfect books ever written.
No, many of the books that you write about have a lot of sex or eroticism or romance in them, of course, which I love, which everybody loves, I think.
Well, this is not a book for kids. This
Right.
is a book for adults, although some of these books are books that I certainly read as a young person. Some of them are so-called classics. Some of them are by dead white guys, but certainly not all of them.
Well, the question actually, just you could take a quick tangent on this. The question is, each book probably has kind of an age appropriateness to them, at least in terms of whether or not the kid can be interested, much less understand the concepts in these novels. And that is the conversation that we need to be having in about education. Is it kind of age appropriate? If so, why? If not, why not? And we can have that discussion, and you do, and you're always party to it. But I think that's the question for each one of these great short books. What's the best kind of age, or what kind of person would enjoy it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, this book is really written for adults. I was talking to a parent the other day about it, and he said he was really looking forward to having his daughter, who's I guess 14 or so, reading some of these books.
Sure.
So some of them are certainly meant for are books that young people can read, but a great many of them are not. These are books that are, in some cases, challenging in the best sense. They are books that are about the big themes in literature: love and marriage, coming of age, coming out, infidelity, and I should mention that all the stories of the writers, the biographies I include, really get into the heart of how troubled so many of these people were. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, they all were very, very troubled people. And there's an interesting question that I raise. Are they writers because they're troubled? Are they troubled because they're writers? Or are they just troubled people who happen to be writers? But very, very fascinating to
I wonder.
Go ahead.
Well, I just wonder, because I was reading about, as you write a little bit about George Orwell's life, and I also I think this a lot about comedians, but all creative types, those who write this type of amazing fiction, it helps at least to have an interesting life. And George Orwell had a crazy life. I mean, he was in wars and saw just about everything and lived in a bunch of different places. Isn't it harder to be someone who just sits in a cabin and comes up with a story than someone who maybe lived things and puts that in their story?
That's a really interesting question. And I think when you look at the biographies of these 58 writers that have included, most of them did lead rather extraordinary lives in many respects. As I mentioned, some of them were very troubled people, troubled marriages, troubled questions of their sexual identity, a lot of alcoholism and depression, to be honest. And certainly you look at somebody like Ernest Hemingway. Speaking of living through wars, the man lived through World War I as a ambulance attendant, then covered World War II, went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War and covered that. Lived this very, very large life, and that fed into all of his fiction. Hemingway is included. He is one of 11 Nobel Prize winners who are in the book. But then you have someone, for instance, like Nadine Gordimer, didn't necessarily go to war. She's a brilliant South African novelist, also a Nobel Prize winner. But her life was lived under apartheid. Although she is white, she was very much involved in the anti-apartheid movement, actually helped Nelson Mandela write a speech that he delivered when he was on trial. So all of these writers have experiences that certainly feed into their fiction. And that's why I say that reading these books and then reading the stories of these writers is truly an education. As as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of history in this book, even though it's a book about
for sure
fiction,
for sure, which is one
but another example, perhaps at the other end, one of my favorite books, which is included, is The Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane. Maybe you had to read it when you were in junior high school. I really advise people with that book and a great many other books that I included that might have been assigned to you in high school or junior high school to go back and read it now. We bring so much more to these books as adults than we might have as young people. And that's one of the real reasons it's important to reread certain great books. But Stephen Crane writes the quintessential Civil War novel, and he'd never been on a battlefield. He'd never set foot on a battlefield. He really created this book out of his imagination, and certainly reading the reports about the Civil War. Later on, he would become a war correspondent of sorts, but and died at an incredibly young age of tuberculosis when he was about 28 years old, I think. So there's a case where somebody who did not have an incredible life experience still was able to turn his limited experience into this extraordinary novel. Then at the other extreme, I suppose you'd have to talk about somebody like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another Nobel Prize winner who's included. His book is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, about life in one day in the life of a prisoner in a Soviet-era Stalinist labor camp. Solzhenitsyn was in one of those labor camps himself for a very, very long time. So clearly, that experience and writing out of that experience is completely quintessential and essential to understanding that book, which had a great deal to do with the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, if you talk about writers who change history, Alexander Solzhenitsyn is one of them. He was a dissident. He wrote this book, which was allowed to be published in the Soviet Union at a moment when there was a little loosening after Stalin's death. Later on, he was sent back into exile, eventually thrown out of the country, charged with treason, and is one of the giants of the 20th century in terms of literature, but also his impact on history. So that's why I say, for people who are familiar with me as a historian, you're going to read this book about books and read a great deal of history.
Yeah. Solzhenitsyn. Did I say it right? I was reading that correct. And trying to pronounce it, and listen, you nailed it 3 times. The Red Badge of Courage, 1895, Stephen Crane. First lines, here it is. The cold passed reluctantly from the earth, and the retiring fogs revealed an army stretched out on the hills, resting. As the landscape changed from brown to green, the army awakened and began to tremble with eagerness at the noise of rumors. Oh, my goodness. It's so good. I love reading the beginnings of so many of these books and then trying to decide what I might read. And I haven't read fiction since I started this job, and it's been really problematic, I think, for a lot of reasons. And I think your new book, Great Short Books, makes a good argument as to why I should be. Also, I thought maybe I would be finding books to suggest to my girls or to Val. And of course, I definitely want to suggest If Beale Street Could Talk to my daughter, who loves love stories. I saw the movie, and of course, that's James Baldwin. But you also tackle, I think, what is you refer to a thorny question as to how you should select these books in terms of, kind of what is correct. The debate over reckoning with writers whose work has fallen from favor, you write, in light of changing conventions, a question raised in the entry on K. Chopin's Awakening. Racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and other isms represent views no longer acceptable thanks to decades of social progress. Then you write here, Kenneth, how then do we deal with writers, many of them dead and unable to respond, whose attitudes about race, gender, and sexual identity are no longer deemed tolerable? And of course, you answer that question in the afterword. I want you to answer it here. How did you deal with that thorny question when selecting these 58 books in Great Short Books?
It was really an important question for me because I believe in the importance of expression and free expression. And again, this is a book that's written for adults, and I hope that adults can bring discernment to reading some of these books. But this is a question that is obviously raised by something as basic as Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, sure, which is not in this. But first of all, it's not short, but for that reason, it was
a lot of N-words in that book.
There is a lot of N-words, and there are other books in this collection that use the N-words. Passing by Nella Larson uses the N-word. A great many others do. And that's a difficult issue today. I don't think that we have to read, first of all, you mentioned the book, The Awakening by Kate Chopin. She never uses the N-word, but she uses other euphemisms for Black people. She was writing late in the 19th century, writing from the postbellum South. Yeah. And there are references to characters who are perhaps house servants that you use words that would no longer be considered politely acceptable. Other writers, Black writers, use those same words. A brilliant, brilliant book called The Middle Passage by a man named Charles Johnson, one of the great books of the past half century or so. He uses the same words. A white writer in 19th century America versus a Black writer in 20th century America. So I think that as a reader, you have to bring a sense of discernment. What was the writer trying to accomplish? Are the views they express their views, or are they the views of the characters they are creating? I think those are really legitimate and fair questions. So I think it's dangerous to just say that because a novel includes a word that we might find distasteful today, that we shouldn't read it. is a very, very dangerous idea. So I'm much more about the belief that we should read these books unless something is obviously, extremely distasteful. And I point to examples of books that I read and did not include, including one that's truly I guess, considered an American classic. I'll come back to it. But that book, and I'm talking about Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote, I was astonished when I read it at the use of the N-word, the homophobic utterances of this iconic character, Holly Golightly, in Truman Capote's original, which is very different, by the way, from the film version of Breakfast at Tiffany's. So I read that book and did not include it as a great short book. Now, I'm not telling anybody don't read it. It's, but I read it and was really surprised that that level of, I think, unacceptable dialogue coming out of the mouth of this character was unacceptable to me. So that's why and again, I say it in the book. I'm not telling you don't read it. I don't think it's a great book, and that's part of the reason why.
This book that you have written and published this was your pandemic project. Great short books. You read all these books, you researched them, and you introduced us to so many new authors. And you also did your best to select a wide diversity of authors. Tell me about another female author. I always think that women, because they were behind in other rights and education and so on, there weren't as many female writers in history. And I'm sure that there's that's right in different countries and different times and so on, and when female writers emerge. But tell me a little bit about that, because I'm sure they always include that journey and that discrimination in their work, in their viewpoints, and it's of great value. Tell me about a lady writer and whether or not I'm right about the opportunities they had to actually write.
It's a very important idea. And of course, yes, women writers, for most of history, many women were not permitted to read, just as enslaved people weren't permitted to read. And certainly many fewer of them wrote, and even fewer were allowed to publish, really well into the 19th century. I mean, there are certainly examples of earlier women writers in American history and in European history, but for the most part, women writers truly emerge in the late 19th century. And the one book that we mentioned already, Kate Chopin's Awakening, speaks to that in a way. It was published, and because it dealt with a woman contemplating adultery, a woman who wanted to learn how to paint and kind of live on her own, that really made this book unacceptable to the American public at the time. So while it was not officially banned by anyone, it was really not sold by the booksellers, and her publishers, she had had several successful books, her publishers canceled all of her future books. So it was a perfect case of a woman writing and being forbidden to write in a sense, because she was writing about subjects that were unacceptable. This book was published late in the 19th century. It kind of disappeared because she had been, in a modern phrase, canceled. And then in the 1960s and 70s, feminist scholars rediscovered this work and found this woman to be a really early voice of feminism, in a sense, a woman having desires, artistic, sexual, personal, that were very far removed from what was acceptable at the time. So that's, I think, a perfect example of what you're talking about. I want to briefly go back to what you said about writing this out of the pandemic. That's absolutely the case of what happened with this book. And like you, I've always been a fiction reader from the time I was a small child. I was a child of the library. went to the public library once a week. The bookmobile came around once a week to our neighborhood. So I was a real kid who went to the library a lot, read nonfiction and fiction, liked them both. Because of my work as a historian over the past 30 years or so, I had read much less fiction. But during the pandemic, when we were all in this terrible moment of doom scrolling, sitting in front of our screens or holding our phones and going through this terrible, terrible news every single minute of every single day, I really got to a point where I said, enough, I have to do something else. And I actually started out by reading a book called The Decameron. It's a big one. It's not a great short book. This was written during the Black Plague in Florence.
No way.
By Giovanni Boccaccio.
Yeah.
And what he did was have 10 characters leave Florence and go to a villa to get away from the plague in Florence. And each day that they're away, each of the 10 characters tells a story. So there are 100 stories in the Decameron. It's really one of the foundational texts in Western literature. It was written in Italian, not in Latin, which most books in Italy before this time had been written in Latin. So it was written in the vernacular, and it became extremely, extremely popular. And so I was reading one story a day from the Decameron, and I realized Boccaccio's onto something here. It's really wonderful to tell short stories, read short stories in the midst of a pandemic. And inspired by that, I started to read short novels, and I started to take some books that were on my own shelves already because you couldn't go to a bookstore, you couldn't go to the public library. Eventually, when they opened up, the library had what they call grab and go. You could order books and you could go in and get them and run out, but not stay in the library. And eventually my neighborhood bookstore reopened to browse, just 5 people at a time. Remember, I mean, that's about a little over 2 years ago. It seems like 100 years ago now.
Kenneth, weren't you just in here an hour ago? Could you please let somebody else come in and browse, please?
Something like that. Yeah, you went in for a few minutes and you knew there was a line of people outside. So
just a bunch of children out there going, I would like to browse. And Kenneth is like, I'm writing a book, and screams. Can you imagine? He would never raise his voice as a child. So you were in there.
I don't yell at the children who want to read books. That's for sure.
So you spent a lot of time in there, and you came up with not only some of these classics and some of their shorter books, because many of them wrote longer books too, but you also introduced us to some new authors. We mentioned Colson Whitehead earlier. You also talk about a book called The Lost Daughter by a woman named Elena Ferrante, who wrote this book in 2006. A 48-year-old divorced professor of literature, Lita is her character, sets off to spend several weeks at a small beach town in the south of Italy. Her 2 grown daughters have gone to live with their father in Canada, and Lita is feeling liberated. That's just the very beginning of the plot. And your obsession, of course, Kenneth C. Davis's, with Italy is certainly mine. But the point I was making was new writers, not necessarily young writers, but new writers too.
That's absolutely the case. I wanted to reread some classics. So I mentioned a couple already. Animal Farm, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Charlotte's Web. These are books that I had read many times before in my life, and I was returning to them. But I deliberately set out to read books that I had never read before, including some by writers I had never read before.
Right.
And because I was studying Italian, several of my professors had recommended books to me, and the works of Elena Ferrante are among those. So The Lost Daughter, which was also made into a film after the book was written. It was a film that was pretty good. Takes some liberties with the plot. For some reason, they moved it to Greece instead of Italy. I didn't understand that, but that's a wonderful book. Elena Ferrante is much more famous now because of a series of books that she wrote called the Neapolitan Quartet. But this book is short, incredibly compressed, gets again into this question of what do women want in a very, very real sense of that word, just as Kate Chopin was writing about that in the late 19th century in The Awakening. Elena Ferrante is writing about this Italian woman thinking about her life, her family, her relationship to her daughters, her relationship to motherhood and womanhood. So these are really, again, big themes, and that's why this is not kiddie lit for most people. But those kind of questions are at the heart of all of the questions that all of us have, and that's what great literature can do. And that's what I think almost all of certainly all of these books do that, and that's why I've included them. The Lost Daughter also falls into a category, a genre of books that I discovered kind of by accident as I was writing this, which is what I call beach books. And by that, I don't mean the books you take down to the beach to enjoy, or I certainly don't mean a beach book like Jaws, in which there's a deadly shark. I was struck by how many books I read that are set at the ocean, at the seaside, in which there are tremendous upheavals in people's lives. You think of sun, sand, and surf as being kind of calm and wonderful, but many of these books that I discovered as beach books really get to a tumultuous scene or a turning point in people's lives, and The Lost Daughter is one of those. The very first book in the series, another book by an Italian, Agostino by Alberto Moravia, about unlike The Lost Daughter about an older woman, Agostino is about a 14-year-old boy who has this magnificent mother who's a beauty. And I write in the book that, we all play the game of casting when we're reading. This woman should be played by, Sophia Loren or maybe Penelope Cruz.
I love that you did that. And also it's important to say that he's hanging out with his beautiful mom in this town, and his dad had died. She's a widow. And then apparently she meets a guy and kind of replaces him, and he falls in with the riffraff. I read just that one just before we got on, and it's just a great example of why great short books is so much fun, because you get to learn about books you've never heard of, authors you've never heard of, and some that you did and never read. So many of these books I'm like, I never read that. And it allowed me to read the beginning of it. It's such a great resource. Everybody has to go get it. I have to go to my physical, but before I do, I want to ask you one more question, because it is about Thanksgiving week. And I've often talked to you about Thanksgiving, and as you call it, well, it's called the 400th anniversary was 2021. And we've talked about it so much, but if I only had one question to be reminded by a thing left, and people should go back and listen to our past interviews or read what you've written about it, I think it's interesting to just talk about the connection between the Civil War and Thanksgiving, if we could.
Absolutely. Since we just talked about the Civil War. And
it's on my mind, and we're kind of like having problems now.
Well, let me just say that in 1863, perhaps the bleakest moment in Abraham Lincoln's presidency, things were not going well. He certainly thought he would not be reelected the following year in 1864. He issues a proclamation of Thanksgiving. This had been at the suggestion of a woman who had been lobbying other presidents about this for 30 years. Lincoln does it in 1863. Now, when he makes this proclamation of Thanksgiving, it has nothing to do with pilgrims, Mayflower, turkeys, and sitting down at a Happy Meal. The idea was that the nation should be grateful for what it has, even in the midst of these terrible things, and also an expression of kind of national identity, that this idea of coming to America for religious freedom, and, I can go into the full debate about what that means as well, and I have, this was the first presidential proclamation setting Thanksgiving on the Thursday in November that became the beginning of an unbroken string of presidential proclamations. It only truly became a national federal holiday in 1941 during the Franklin D. Roosevelt's terms. But this was a moment that Lincoln said, we have to still be grateful, no matter how bad things are in the country right now. So I think it's important to always go back and remember those elements of what Thanksgiving means. And it has a lot of different meaning to a lot of different people. I know that for indigenous people, it is a day of mourning, and I appreciate and understand that. But a fascinating piece of history. And during the Civil War, a group called the Union League actually filled ships with turkeys and pies and all the sides and trimmings and sent them to the troops in Virginia that were on the front lines fighting the Civil War. So a very close connection between the true establishment of the Thanksgiving tradition in the midst of the Civil War. I wrote about this in the New York Times. You can find the piece on my website, don'tknowmuch.com, right now.
Go to don'tknowmuch.com, get the rest of Kenneth C. Davis's books. If you're a listener and you love when he joins us, as many of you always do, you should ask for them for Christmas. When you're hard to shop for kind of person, say, go to don'tknowmuch.com and get me all of these books, because they have been such a great source of learning, education, and pleasure for me, as has our conversations. I am so grateful. Whenever I get the opportunity to talk to you, you're a national treasure, and you have done it again. Great short books. Congratulations. Thank you very much for joining me. I can't wait till we talk again, and I will be finishing reading this up over the break. I am so grateful to you. Congrats. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. It's always a pleasure, and enjoy your holiday. And we all, in spite of the darkness around us, we still have lots to be grateful for. So
indeed, we do. But I do have a great conversation with Kenneth C. Davis, and I'll be posting new conversations tomorrow and Friday as well. Thank you for listening. Thank you for pressing play, for subscribing, for your paid subscription. If you're not signed up for a paid subscription, you should do that right now, standupwithpete.com. And I hope that you, if I don't talk to you, if you don't hear from me, have a great Thanksgiving or whatever that you do. I hope you get some time off. Now it's time to get to that conversation with my favorite historian. He's written so many great books. You got to get them all. If you're thinking about a gift for somebody who listens to the show, ask for this gift. Get all of Kenneth C. Davis's books. don'tknowmuch.com. And today, well, we went live. This first couple minutes is us live on Twitter a couple days ago, and then the rest of our conversation. He's still on Twitter, if that's a thing. Get this book. You won't regret it. It's a great gift. Let's do it. Oh, man, that is it. Kenneth C. Davis, what did you think? I hope you liked it. I appreciate you listening to that conversation. I think you should probably go buy the book. Go to don'tknowmuch.com to get all of Kenneth C. Davis's stuff. Great short books. It's so much fun. You will not regret this high recommendation. I give it a high recommendation. The Pete Dominic 5 stars, if you will. Created a whole new rating system for books and authors here at the end of today's episode. That's it. That's all I've got. I hope you have a great day, and thanks for listening. And I will talk to you tomorrow, which is Thanksgiving, from my parents' kitchen in upstate New York. In the meantime, be well, my friends. Bye-bye.
Start making sense and you stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. While you lying awake wondering where the money all went, it'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.